Some people come to this meeting may think the title is a bit strange. Why should we talk about workers' power or popular power, since living in a country where at the moment the choice for most people seems between Gordon Brown and Cameron, the workers' power seems a bit abstract and popular power seems a bit abstract. But what I would argue, and I think it's quite important for people to argue, is what I've argued in the new little book I produced, Revolution of the 21st Century. If you talk in terms not much just of what's going to happen the next year, or the next 5 years, or the next 10 years, there's all sorts of characteristic features about capitalism in the 21st century that means again and again we're going to see in one part of the world or another sudden upheavals. When you know that Tony Blair's court sociologist, now Tony Blair has gone, I don't know whether his court sociologist has gone as well, but his court sociologist, Anthony Giddens, wrote a book called A Runaway World, a world which is out of control. And what he really means is the process of what he calls globalization, what we'd call the way in which capitalism has expanded beyond national frontiers, in a way in which the national states can no longer control the processes or exercise much influence over the dynamic of capitalism. When that occurs, in the face of that, what we're going to see magnified 1,000 times is what Marx talked about in the Communist Manifesto, when he talked about the continual revolutionising of the means of production, the revolutionising of the relations of production, tearing apart all the old structures people took for granted, everything which was sacred become profane, everything was solid melts into air. When you talk in terms of that, the structures of the world in the 21st century, that's a situation which we are going to see again and again. Social structures torn apart by economic crises, torn apart by wars, torn apart by the impact in terms of the massive tensions in societies, the climate change takes effect. In that sense, we're going to talk in which what are the alternatives, or what alternatives people turn to will become absolutely central. And here we have to say a few basic elementary things. If you look at the history of the 20th century, you find two things, and two apparently contradictory things. Every time people begin to look for change in society, they begin initially to focus upon the idea that you can change things through parliamentary means. Or if you don't have a parliament, you fight to establish a parliament. But yet, at the same time, you find something else that happens. At every point, those people who control the old order then see that parliamentary forms of democracy have a particular way of which can be used to neutralise movements to moving forward. If you look, it's quite interesting. You find the same phenomenon used again and again. In the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, the very forces which have stopped the democratisation of German society, right from 1848 onwards, the very forces that stopped the democratisation of German society, when German society was thrown into deep crisis, then immediately agreed there should be a general election called as rapidly as possible, because they saw through the process of general election takes place, normal upheavals and struggles are meant to stop while people passively go and vote. When they vote, all the old forms of society, the media and so forth, can exercise some control how they vote, and the voting is used as a means of controlling the revolution dynamic. And it's not happened once, it happens again and again. People remember the Portuguese Revolution of 1974 to 1975. The use of the parliamentary election as used an alternative to stop the dynamic from below proceeding further. And therefore you find these two elements, the use of parliamentary democracy, on one hand it represents some way of people trying to find a way of exercising their control, but then they begin to exercise, they find it's no real control. Why is it no real control? Because it's restricted to just one small area. It's restricted to who you vote for in a parliament, who you vote for your president. It does not affect, it doesn't involve voting who's going to run the state machine. It doesn't involve voting who are going to be the officers of the armed forces, who are going to be the head of the state bureaucracy. It doesn't involve voting on who's going to be the judges. It doesn't involve anything more than a small part of the state machine. And certainly it does not involve who's going to control the great force of economic power, who's going to control the corporations, the factories, the mines, the offices, and so forth. And therefore, in a certain sense, restricted democracy has always, often ruling class resist in restricted democracy, but when they're forced to make concessions, they use restricted democracy, parliamentary democracy, in order to try and control the movement. in order to ensure, if you like, that the old boss is replaced by the new boss. But then you find something quite interesting if you follow through the further processes. You find that people who've been given restricted democracy, people who once fought for it, can very, very rapidly become disillusioned with it. You even find this, it's quite amazing today if you look at Eastern Europe. When the great turmoil took place in Eastern Europe in 1989, 1990, 1991, the central demand for people became the demand for the right to have free elections. You look now at Eastern Europe, and it's incredible. You have elections which are lucky if 30 or 40% of the population vote. The demand for free elections, when conceded this limited control over one marginal fraction of what really influences people's lives, gives way to disillusionment. But if you're talking, but also what's very, very important in terms of the revolutionary processes of the 20th century, and I would argue in terms of the revolutionary process of the 21st century, something more begins to develop. People begin to talk in terms of more thoroughgoing, deep-seated forms of trying to control things. This is why what begins as a revolutionary ferment contained within society has the ability to go much, much deeper. Just to give one example, in the German Revolution of 1918-1919, they held elections in January 1919, and as if all the people who had been involved in the revolutionary process, the great majority thought it was just good enough to get the tame opposition from the old regime, the old order, and put them in control over the new order. So the far left of the elections of January 1919, I think, got 2.5% of the vote, or 3% of the vote. The sort of vote which, if we had any form of proportional representation, the Socialist Workers' Party will respect, would get more than that in Britain today. You look there, they had further elections late in 1920, and the 2.5% of the vote suddenly shot up to 15 or 16 or 17% of the vote. All sorts of people who voted for the tame parties began to change, workers changed their mind in the course of 18 months of revolutionary upheaval. But more than that, you find the same processes again. If you talk in terms of the Spanish Revolution of 1936, the beginning of 1936 in Spain, people voted. They voted by a very, very narrow majority for a party dominated by what we'd call left-wing liberals, left-wing Republicans. 6 months later, when the Civil War broke out, in the Republican zone, so far was people radicalised that the Parliament that's been elected in January didn't meet for 12 months. I mean, I've never found out whether it met after 12 months either. There may be someone expert on the Spanish Civil War who knows this. But the actual process of revolutionising went far beyond the normal domains of parliamentary democracy. Today you find the same contradiction taking place. It's not just the 20th century. You find the same process taking place in Venezuela. Chavez has won, I have to get the right number, 4 votes in 9 years, been elected 3 times and defeated a referendum attempt to overthrow him once. Elections took place to the Parliament 18 months ago, and you think all this enthusiasm for Chavez would reflect itself in people voting for the Parliament. When it came to the parliamentary elections, the right-wing opposition tried to boycott the parliamentary elections. The Chavez supporters tried to get their members out as a vote of confidence, not just in Chavez, but in the Parliament, and the turnout for the parliamentary election was less than 30%. That is, once people begin to see society changing, the old parliamentary structures no longer satisfactory. Why? Because the old parliamentary structures do not control the things that influence people's real lives. They don't determine their jobs. They don't determine how the police behave. They don't determine how the army behaves. Other processes and other forces are at work. And therefore, in every great revolutionary upheaval, you look at how people begin to look towards more radical ways of changing and controlling things. That's why when we talk about the 19th century, you talk about the Paris Commune of 1871, you talk about the population of Paris throwing up something much more radical, much more revolutionary than any normal parliamentary structure. A structure in which you elect your delegates, the delegates are subject to recall, in which the delegates don't earn more than the average wage of the people who elect them, in which the delegates themselves take direct control of the various functions carried out in the past by bureaucratic hierarchies. When we talk in terms of the Russian Revolution of 1900, or the unsuccessful Russian Revolution of 1905, and the successful Russian Revolution of 1917, we talk about the emergence of councils. The Russian word Soviet just means councils. People, delegates elected from workers in their workplaces, electing delegates who get together in each locality, and then the delegates of different localities meeting together, so that you have a structure in which the people elect and can replace when they want people who work alongside them, who they know, whose record they know intimately from recent years, who they can test what they're doing, and so on and so forth. And delegates which are not merely sitting there and voting once a year on this policy or that policy, but delegates in a capacity control exactly how the revolutionary process moves forward. What actually emerges in such revolutionary processes, the very organisations which are used to fight against the old order of class society, transform themselves into organs capable of running a new society. It's a process that, if you want to imagine it, it's a process which Antonio Gramsci tried to foresee how it could happen in Italy. He could see how workers in the factories, the big factories in Turin, had what were effectively shop stewards. They're called workers' commissioners. And he argued the workers' commissioners, that form of election, could be turned in terms, those could be turned into a factory council, the factory council could federate, and then you'd have a structure of a workers' council form of organisation in control of Italian industry, but then organising itself to take control of the state structures and state functions in a completely different way to existence in parliamentary democracy. And this may sound, and I could go on at great length about how amazingly you find very similar structures emerging in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. How faced with a collapse of the old Russian-controlled state, the Russian army being forced to withdraw from Budapest, the workers organise themselves in the factories and begin to take control of the factories, and then when the Russian army comes back and reinvades Budapest, the organisations of the different factories get together, form the Greater Budapest Workers' Council, and effectively operate as a government running Budapest in opposition to the Russian troops trying to impose their government. This is what a great upheaval talks about, seems like. And I could go on. You've talked, no doubt, there's Colin Barker in the room who's written a very good book on Poland in 1980 to 1981. He will describe to you how the great strikes in the shipyards in 1980 in Poland, what emerged was what later called itself a trade union, but in reality, in its first stage, was workers electing their own delegates to organise their strike, but having organised their strike, represent then a counterpower based upon the mass of the population in opposition to the power of the capitalist state. Now, what's interesting is we're now seeing those sorts of questions begin to be raised again. They're being raised particularly in Latin America, where the series of uprisings in the last I forget how many years, 6 years since the first 7 years since the first uprising in Bolivia, beginning of the year 2000. The two uprisings in Bolivia, the first rising in Ecuador, the two uprisings in Ecuador, the two uprisings in Bolivia, the uprising in Argentina, the uprising which brought Chavez back from imprisonment in an island off the Venezuelan coast, back to the presidential palace. Out of that experience, you again have people beginning to see that the old forms of parliamentary democracy are not sufficient. You find it in Bolivia, when after they succeeded for the second time in overthrowing a president, when they overthrew Mesa, the president in June, I have to get the exact time, 2 years ago, wasn't it? Or 3 years ago? 2004. June 2004, when they overthrew Mesa, then people began to talk about how do we make sure this doesn't happen again. And you began one of the important centres of the movement in Cochabamba. The people who led the movement for the previous 4 years began to say we need to talk in terms of how we begin to build something new, some real form of democracy. And they used a term very, very common in Latin America. They used the word not workers' power, but poder popular, popular power or people's power. You find then when in Oaxaca, in Mexico, last year you had an amazing situation developing. You had a teacher's strike a teacher strike, faced with the refusal of the local governor to concede the demands, the corrupt governor, then attacks upon the teachers' strike, the whole of the city of Oaxaca, a city of more than 1 million people at the center of important province in Mexico, rises up. It's a peaceful rising. They might succeed peacefully in driving the police and the army out of the city, and you have the formation of a committee which calls itself, I can never remember the exact term of the committee, which is effectively a committee of delegates from the popular organisations, which maintains control of Oaxaca for some weeks before it's crushed mercilessly with a high level of repression by the central state. And you also have now in Venezuela taking place the question of the way in which, amazingly, Chavez, at the top of society, beginning to feel that the state machine underneath him, he controls the old Venezuela is run by an old state machine, run the old hierarchical lines, the absolutely corrupt. I mean, I discovered how corrupt the state machine in Venezuela was when we went to the World Social Forum, and I went through there by myself, and I walked to the airport, and a very friendly policeman comes up to me and says, "Can I help you?" And I think, this is a bit strange, maybe this is popular power. And he takes me down a staircase into the basement area of the airport, and he's taking me to try and persuade me to change money illegally with some rate which he alleges would be above the official rate. No doubt also probably got counterfeit notes if I'd followed some advice. But this is a state machine which is corrupt. I was advised in Venezuela by a North American who was working in helping to build the World Social Forum, be there some weeks. He says, whatever you do, keep away, I think, with the police dressed in blue. These are the ones who do everything they can to fraudulently arrest tourists so that they can then blackmail you into giving them money. I mean, this is, against this sort of state machine, Chavez, feeling isolated at the top of society, then issues a call for people to establish popular power. And the slogan, "Create popular power," is a very, very widespread slogan in Venezuela today. Now here, however, we have to come up against something, because people sometimes say, well, you Marxists, you always talk about workers' power. Why don't you talk about popular power? Is there any difference? And sometimes it comes out in another way. People think the translation of the slogan we chant in Britain, "The workers united should never be defeated," they think the Spanish translation of this is "the people united will never be defeated." But that is a difference, and I'll try and explain the difference and why it's important. The question of popular power has an ambiguity involved in it, or at least one ambiguity. The ambiguity is this. If you talk about the people in a particular country, the people are divided into classes. Now, the contradiction, and therefore when people use the phrase popular power, they aren't redefining which group, which class in society holds power and fights for power. Now, there's a further ambiguity that in some countries the word people is usually referred to as the masses of people as opposed to the elite. But it's often used in this ambiguous way. We had it, people who heard this debate I had with Diane Rebbe, I think yesterday, would have heard her referring to fighting for the Venezuelans, as if the Venezuelans are a single mass. They're not. The Venezuelans are divided into two major classes, a bourgeoisie and a working class, a certain number of peasants, and a middle class. They're not one homogeneous mass. The slogan "People's Power" conceals that. It conceals more than that, though. Even when it's used in terms of meaning the mass of people at the bottom of society, it doesn't address the question really of where the focus, how you focus the power. Where does the force come from to change society? And therefore, in Venezuela, you're having established communal councils. The communal councils are grouped together. Every 400 households are grouped in a communal council. It sounds wonderful. The communal councils would discuss how resources are allocated, which are given from the state. There's two problems with it. One, they discuss how resources are allocated, which are given to them from above. They're not controlling the resources. They're not fighting for the control of the allocation of the resources. But the second question, of course, if you talk about communal councils, there are councils in poor barrios, there are councils in middle-class barrios, there are councils in upper-class barrios. You're not talking about how you focus and organise the thing. By contrast, why Marxists have always talked about workers' councils, and it's very, very important, because when you talk about a capitalist society, virtually any capitalist society today, the majority of the wealth in society is produced by people who work as wage labourers. Even in a country like India, you can go through the breakdown. I think about a third of output is produced in agriculture, a third in industry, and a third in services. That is, even though the industrial working class is very, very small, it's relatively small in India. I say very small, I have to be careful. Someone once said to me it was only consisted of 5% of the population, but 5% of 1,200 million is an awful lot of people. But that working class produces the majority of the value in that society, and therefore the working class has the capacity to paralyse capitalist society insofar as it's organised and unites together. It has something else. The working class is concentrated together in a way which other classes aren't. If you talk in terms of India or Latin America or Africa, you talk about a very, very, very big, what someone called the informal sector, of people who live by doing things like selling shoelaces, haggling with people, begging, living by running stalls by the market. A huge mass of people. But they're not concentrated together to form a organic whole which can act as a whole in opposition to capitalist society. The working class, people forced into the same relation, forced together into collectivity, being exploited by a single exploiter, have the capacity to act together. They act together, and when they act together, they have the power to freeze the value creation of capitalist society. Therefore, when you're talking to the working class, it has that capacity to act collectively, which other classes don't. And therefore, when we say workers' power, what we're not saying the working class is better than the other oppressed and exploited classes. There's no particular value, and there's no reason why a worker should be more moral than a peasant, or a small petty boy, the smallest, the self-employed, or the people who live begging, and so on and so forth. It's not that. We're saying the working class has that capacity to act collectively, and in acting collectively, it can begin to change its consciousness about new ideas in a way which is vastly easier for it to do so than other classes. When society enters a deep political and economic crisis, political, social and economic crisis, the working class can emerge as a force offering an alternative. If it can emerge as a force offering an alternative, then you have to talk about a form of organisation of society that reflects that force. That's why when we talk in terms of workers' councils, not popular power. Workers' power, not popular power. That's not, of course, the end of the process. Because, particularly in societies in which the working class is a minority of the population, it's always possible in a period of great crisis that political figures emerge, who attempt in one way or another temporarily to buy off the working class, to offer it concessions, or to turn the working class against the more oppressed, against the oppressed people who don't have proper paid employment. For us, we always have to argue, it's not a question just of the working class moving forward, it's working class moving forward, if I want to use the words used by Lenin, later taken up by Antonio Gramsci, the much abused Italian revolutionary. The working class has to emerge as a force putting forward a collective alternative to capitalist society, but it has to emerge as a hegemonic force. That is, it has to put forward demands which not merely relate to demands of workers, but draw other groups in. But then when you look at every great revolution, you actually do see this process taking place. It's quite miraculous. In the Russian Revolution of 1917, once it became clear the workers' councils existed, all sorts of other groups of society began to form councils. And we had, some years back, we had a sympathiser of the Socialist Workers' Party who actually, she died about several years back, who had actually lived through the Russian Revolution, described being on, I think, a railway carriage, how they elected a council on the railway carriage. The impulse given by workers' power was to draw every other, I don't know if people on railway carriages are oppressed, but I would say every other oppressed and exploited group into the process. It's not a question of workers' councils just emerging and sitting there. There has to be a fight, a political fight within them, for them to go out and organise other groups. Nevertheless, the way the process has to, seeing it that way, is very, very important. If you want to talk, I think there's a comrade in the room may talk about Chile in 1972-73. Some of the revolutionary left said what we need are what they called communal commandos. Other people said workers are forming forms of workers' councils, the cordones, we have to put the cordones at the front and draw the other groups behind them. Other people did not understand this. They believed you could just organise in the localities without having the workers' council at the centre. When you talk in terms of Venezuela today, just organise us in localities. People can put forward demands, but they don't have the power to impose those demands on society. They don't have the power to reorganise society from the bottom upwards, the productive apparatus of society to do that. They only do have that insofar as at the centre of it there's a core of workers' power drawing in the other groups. And I want to take up a point which has been raised by a couple of people at this at Marxism, one of the earlier meetings. People say, but that's all 20th century stuff. The centrality of the working class, the centrality of the workplace and so forth. Now here we have to be very careful. There's a very popular ideology going around which says really, it's not saying necessarily the working class has disappeared, that big workplaces have disappeared, the working class is fragmented, it's not bound down and so on and so forth. The reality is rather different. The reality is the transformations of capitalism we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years in the advanced industrial country mean that what used to be some very, very enormous workplaces are now smaller. And some big enormous workplaces have disappeared. But it doesn't mean that most people do not work in workplaces with one or two people. If you talk in terms of a city like London, you actually say there are huge workplaces in London. Heathrow Airport, people don't not understand this, is as big as Fort Dagenham ever was. Gatwick Airport is as big as Fort Dagenham ever was. Stansted Airport is growing. I don't think it's as big as Fort Dagenham, but it's as big as many of the other plants we used to see. When you talk in terms of the number of people working in the banks of the City of London, these places are enormous. Workforces of thousands, and to be honest, all the people working in the banks are not rich bankers getting massive bonuses. Very, very large numbers of cleaners, of typists, of people working on processors, people working in call centres and so on and so forth. People still gather together collectively under capitalism. Even when you talk about, people think about Latin America, they think, oh, somewhere like Bolivia, it can't be workers in large workplaces. Well, it's true. Most workers in Bolivia do not work in large workplaces. But it's quite interesting. You find that, I do have the figures here, in Bolivia in 1995, there were, there's very different figures, 400,000 people in manufacturing industry, 38% of them worked in workplaces of more than 30 workers. That is, everywhere there are congregations of workers getting together. Therefore, when we talk about the 21st century, what we have to think in terms of pushing the revolution forward. You have to think in terms of it's in the workplaces that people are concentrated together. Concentrated together in the workplaces, they have the potential to develop a collective understanding, collective grasp of what provides society forward and developing that. Having done that, you then have to work out, we don't have to work it out, they have to work out, they will work out in the process, in any revolutionary process, how they draw in other groups. How you draw in the isolated people, the people involved in teleworking at home, the people, the unemployed, in the third world cities, the marginalised sectors of the population, who sometimes can be the majority of the sector of the population in the third world city. How you draw those in. But you have to talk at the centre of it, some form of collective organic organisation. And that's why, for me, when I was in a little pamphlet or a little book, I shouldn't call it a pamphlet, no one pays £6 for things, it's just a little pamphlet. The little book, Revolution in the 21st Century, for me the example of the 20th century still remains central. The central demand is, we talk in terms of workers' power. Workers' power can be core of drawing together all the oppressed and exploiting. If you want to call that popular power, call it popular power. But don't start with the idea it's the people united, start with the idea it's the workers united. I'll go back to what I said when I spoke, and I think it's quite important. When we talk about popular power and workers' power, we're not saying that the rise of demand for popular power in itself is a bad thing. Actually, it reflects the real feeling of people that they want to control society from below. The trouble is that it's formulated in terms, in ambiguous terms, which make it quite easy for it to turn into very, very different to what it's meant to be. Some people in the room will remember the term people's power was first used widely in Britain, which was in Philippines when they overthrew Marcos. That must have been 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and everyone said this is why it shows people's power, people's power, people's power. But unfortunately, that people's power did not find crystallisation in terms of democratic organisation of some force which could determine what replaced Marcos. So we got Corrie Carino, and then we got some general, and so on and so forth, and basically capitalism continues just as bad as ever in the Philippines. Therefore, that's why we have to be very careful. When people start chanting, the people united will not be defeated, we don't just go and shout, oh, stop it, stop it, stop it. But we have to understand the limitations of that slogan. And that's why, and therefore, where the slogan arises of people's power, the job of revolutionaries is to try and find ways of translating that into the organisation of workers, and to find ways which you can give it some expression in terms of working class organisation. Now, when we talk in those terms, we then have to, in our terms, we have to be very, very careful. All across the world, there are always people who say the workers do not matter. When someone said only 3% of Venezuelan workers are in unions, well, I know the UNT claim a membership of 1.5 million, which would make the population of Venezuela about 100 million. It's only 20 million, so someone's got their figures wrong. But more to the point, if you want to talk in, say, Venezuela about where you see expressions of working class democracy, you find it in the factories. If you go to an occupied factory, I've been to one of the occupied factories in Venezuela, what is incredible is you have the women who occupy the factory, many of whom never thought about politics. When the occupation began, it was provoked by the behaviour of the manager, who tried to run away, I think, close the factory and run away with the money, essentially. These women were suddenly, they were together, day after day, occupying the factory, discussing what they could do, discussing how they could change things. They were transformed in the process. And that's important because that is the difference between organisation in a workplace and organisation in localities. Usually in a locality, you think a very powerful local movement, but it's usually a minority movement. A fantastically important movement in Argentina was the movement of the Piqueteros, because it meant the unemployed, for the first time for a very long time anywhere in the world, the unemployed were organised. Except, if you go through the figures, the Piqueteros were 100,000 people. The number of unemployed in Buenos Aires in the beginning of 1992 was 5 million. I mean, I'm sorry. It was very, very important to have that organisation, but it was not an organisation of all the unemployed. It was an organisation, the Argentinians tend to use words I don't particularly like, but the organisation of the vanguard of the unemployed, who occasionally could get the passive support of the majority of the others. When you talk about a strike, it's not just an organisation and passive support. Everyone has to decide they're going to be part of the strike. Have to make a decision not to go through the picket line, even though your job's at risk. And it's a different sort of process. And that's where we make the distinction. And therefore, for us, when we talk about the working class mobilising, there is nothing like there's nothing like seeing workers mobilise. Unfortunately, in Britain, for many of it's a memory of seeing a real mobilisation, real activity. When you see it, it's incredible. I remember going to the steelworkers strike in 1990, and I living in London, I thought the Tories are doing very, very well. This strike's going to be passive. I nearly wrote an article for Social Review saying the strike is passive. Fortunately, I went to the picket line, and it was like a military operation. The whole workforce divided up. You lot, your column 1, your column 2, your column. It's like seeing an army being organised to do the picketing. And the picketing was incredibly effective. I mean, unfortunately, the strike was defeated by the union leadership after, I think, 16 weeks, a long strike. But the picketing was effective, and that's what you see. That doesn't mean, I should insist on this. Does not mean what we say don't be involved in local organisation. Local activities are fantastically important. The 10% you might get involved in tenants' activity is incredibly important. Firstly, you're involving at least some people, and secondly, many of those people themselves will be workers, and one way to get to the factories is to go through local activity. Just as we always said in 68, there were some people who said in 68, this is a petty bourgeois movement of students. We said the student movement has its limitations, but the students can provide a dynamism, a yeast, which can create repercussions inside the workers' movement. You build revolutions among the students, it's a bridge towards the workers' movement. You work in the localities. So it doesn't important. We have a comrade, I've forgotten his name, a comrade very, very heavily involved, Alan Walters, very, very heavily involved in defence council housing. What he does is fantastic. But he will say to you that the number of people turn up to the meetings usually is much, much smaller than turning up to a strike meeting among workers. What he does is important because it begins to draw together the element the working class can fight. Well, it's not strong enough if you're kind of fight in the factories. You have they have a system whereby you have a vote over their council housing going to be privatised. Being able to vote the right way is a sign of recovery of confidence, but it also leads back into the factories. But it's not a substitute for it. Now, the thing raised about the last piece, the spatial organisation of capital, it is a problem. The reality is, when I went to the steel strike in 1990, oh God, it shows how old I am. When I went to the steel strike, the reality was it's the steelworks, and it was steelworks next to the village where people lived. It's much, much easier to mobilise people like that than a situation where my mum, before she died, lived in a village halfway between London and Coventry, and I said, what do people do here? They work. Some work in London, some work in Coventry. That is a problem in terms of organisation. But in that situation, it's a problem we face. But I also believe that when we have a revival of working class movement, people find ways of solving it. I mean, I think it's fantastic. You know, I can imagine here, but just as it's possible to drop a utopia what socialism will like in the future, I could drop a utopia of what next big strike in say Heathrow Airport would be when they occupy Heathrow Airport and have to keep in contact with the people living 50 or 60 miles away. Well, I think they will run internet television systems and bring people into communication. There's all sorts of ways which you have to go beyond it. But this is a question of what I always say is, well, you have to imagine a big strike, certainly a revolution. All the mental energy that's wasted under capitalism is people direct it towards how do you fight, but also how do you reorganise society, and they've solved those problems. But they're problems which have to be solved. But in saying that doesn't diminish. I think the workplace in some ways become more central under this situation because it's, if you talk about the housing estate on which I live, it's a poor housing estate, except some of the people on the housing estate are not that poor. There's a conglomeration of different interests, different attitudes and so forth. They're not homogenous in the same way that people work in a factory. The last thing about the informal sector in what some people call the third world, some people call the global south. I think this is a problem. It's a problem for us because, if everyone homogeneously had been brought into big workplaces, it'd be much easier to organise than when you have the situation. Some people are in big workplaces, some people in small workplaces, some people are unemployed, some people are selling shoelaces, some people are driving taxis, some people are just begging. And, if you talk about a city like Mumbai, you're talking about possibly half the population in that category. But you have to say that you can't organise that section of the population just by organising them. That is the labour of Sisyphus, trying to organise those people on a communal basis, unless something is done. If an attempt is made to drive them off their homes, which is happening at the moment in Mumbai, if you have 1 million people being threatened, being driven from their homes so that they can do development, of course you can organise them in that situation. But in the normal humdrum everyday life, the pressures on them are so great, you can organise the minority. Therefore, you have to think about where are the focuses where you can organise them. And that's why we say the focus is you have to find ways of beginning to organise in the workplaces. Not organising the workplace to neglect the rest, but of course the workplace is a place in which you give some sense of power which draws everyone else into the movement. And I should say here how difficult it is varies enormously from city to city. I mean, not all third world cities are the same. In Mumbai, the textile industry has been destroyed. Or actually the big textile factories have been destroyed. In Karachi, there are still enormous textile factories. Our little tiny group in Pakistan are able to sell their papers, not particularly successfully, but that's because of the political atmosphere, outside enormous textile factories. The workers in those textile factories are not organised. They're on short-term contracts, but they have the power, if they understand it, to strike, to struggle, to at least to enforce the management to give them proper contracts to get foreign security of employment, and if they really struggle, to overturn the dictatorship in Pakistan. They have that capacity. In Bombay, it's rather different. The textile factory is replaced by what are called by power looms. Power looms are based upon really few small group of workers, 4 or 5 workers, working in effectively what is a garage, producing it. But the people producing the power looms still have the potential power in the sense they are the textile industry of India. To organise them is much more difficult to organise the big textile fields. But there you have to talk about how you find the place you can organise. When you've organised a medium-sized workplace, a big workplace, then you have to send out the pickets, not just to shut down places, but to organise the other places and so forth. And this is exactly the process which Colin Bach described in Poland. I'm sure as the South Korean comrades have described, that's exactly what happened in South Korea in 1987 and 1988 with the great explosion in South Korea. You found group of people thought were unorganisable were suddenly organised overnight. Now, the last thing is in doing this, you can't do this. To do this, when we talk about the Revolutionary Party, what we mean is not saying counterpose the organisation of the class. We mean drawing together the most conscious elements inside the working class. Those people are lucky enough to see a bit further than other workers at this point in time. And in drawing them together, this is incredibly important to solve the problems we're talking about. You have to talk in terms of a struggle takes place in one factory in a third world city. The minority are already conscious. They have to be the ones who begin to say we have to go and organise the others. And this applies in Venezuela. Someone said, where is the beginnings of the Revolutionary Party in Venezuela? I think what I'd say is a revolutionary party in Venezuela which is not organised. What do I mean by that? You have a revolutionary process. You have some people who see it needs to go much further than others. Those people in Venezuela, many of them begin to see it needs to go further. They're not confident enough yet that they can break with the Chavez organisation. They're not clear what's way forward. But in every locality in Venezuela, you find people who are doubtful about the way the thing is going at the moment, who see the way the need things go further. And I should say here, there are important little embryos of what can develop in the Revolutionary Party. The Sikh Cura current, the class struggle Cura current inside the UNT, the key cadres on it are people who do see the need for some sort of revolutionary development. Some of the former anarchists like Roland Dennis, who spoke here last year, they do see the need for some sort of process. And I think that providing imperialism doesn't succeed in crushing the movement in Venezuela in the near future, I think as the process develops, you will find developing a clear revolutionary current developing inside the Venezuelan working class.